You've probably noticed something strange happening lately. You sit across from your oldest friend at that familiar coffee shop, the same one you've been going to for years, and somewhere between the small talk about their job and the latest Netflix series everyone's watching, you realize you're not really there. Not in the way you used to be. You're nodding, you're smiling, you're making all the appropriate sounds, but inside there's this growing hollowness, this exhausting awareness that you're performing a version of yourself that no longer exists. And here's what nobody tells you about spiritual awakening, the part that doesn't make it into the inspirational quotes or the meditation apps. It's not just that you're losing friends. It's what you lose while trying desperately to keep them. If you're experiencing this right now, if you've been forcing yourself to show up to gatherings that leave you drained for days, if you've been wondering why maintaining these connections feels like it's slowly destroying something essential within you, then please subscribe to Alan Watts Insights, because what I'm about to share with you will finally name the invisible cost you've been paying. This isn't about being superior or more evolved than anyone else. This is about understanding the profound energetic and psychological toll of trying to inhabit two incompatible realities simultaneously. Let me paint you a picture. It's Friday night, and your phone lights up with a group chat you've been part of for 10 years. Everyone's making plans, the usual bar, the usual conversations, the usual patterns you could predict in your sleep. And something in your chest tightens, not because you dislike these people, not because they've done anything wrong, but because you know, with a certainty that makes you feel both guilty and exhausted, that if you go, you'll spend the entire evening pretending to care about topics that feel increasingly hollow, pretending to laugh at jokes that no longer resonate, pretending that the person you were 6 months ago, a year ago, still exists. And here's what's happening in those moments that you probably haven't fully articulated to yourself yet. You're not just code, switching, or putting on social manners. You're engaging in what psychologists call self-betrayal, and your nervous system, that ancient, honest mechanism that doesn't care about social niceties, is registering it as a threat. Research actually confirms this. When we force ourselves into social situations that require us to mask our authentic self, the amygdala, that primitive alarm center in our brain, lights up as if we're in actual danger. It begins flooding our body with cortisol, the stress hormone, because from a neurological standpoint, self-betrayal and physical threat create nearly identical responses. Your body is literally telling you that maintaining this performance is dangerous. But let's go deeper, because this isn't simply about feeling uncomfortable at parties. What's really happening is a form of cognitive dissonance so profound that it fragments your sense of reality. You see, when you undergo a spiritual awakening, when consciousness shifts and you begin seeing through the illusions that most of society operates within, you don't just gain new perspectives. You become, in a very real sense, a different frequency. And I don't mean that in some vague metaphysical way. I mean that your nervous system, your emotional responses, your capacity for depth, your tolerance for superficiality, all of these fundamentally reorganize themselves. You're like a radio that's been tuned to a different station. The old programming doesn't just sound different. It becomes almost unbearable to sit through. And so when you try to force yourself back into those old friend groups, those old patterns, you're not just being polite or making an effort. You're asking your entire system to vibrate at a frequency it has evolved beyond. It's like asking a butterfly to squeeze itself back into the caterpillar's skin and act as if nothing has changed. Alan Watts understood this better than perhaps anyone. He spoke extensively about the persona, that word which comes from the Latin term for the masks that actors wore in ancient theater. In society, we're constantly performing these personas, these socially constructed identities that allow us to function within the collective. And for most of your life, you probably didn't even realize you were wearing a mask because it fit so seamlessly. It was you, or so you thought. But awakening does something radical. It shows you the mask. It creates a gap between who you really are and who you've been pretending to be. And once you see that gap, once you feel it, you can never fully inhabit the mask again with the same unconsciousness. Watts said, "When you no longer confuse yourself with the definition of yourself that others have given you, then you are at peace." But the transition between confusion and clarity, that's where the suffering lies. That's where you find yourself sitting in rooms full of people you've known for years, feeling more alone than you ever did in actual solitude. And here's the thing that you must understand. Your old friends, they haven't necessarily done anything wrong. They haven't betrayed you or changed, at least not in the way you have. What's happened is that you've stepped out of a shared reality, a shared frequency, and now when you interact, it's as if you're speaking different languages while using the same words. They talk about ambitions, and you hear fear. They discuss achievements, and you see the endless treadmill of the ego. They gossip about others, and you feel the violence of unconscious judgment. Not because you're better than them, but because your lens has fundamentally shifted. You're seeing the mechanics behind behaviors that once seemed normal, even desirable, and trying to engage with those old patterns without pointing out what you now see. That requires a level of pretending that becomes psychologically and spiritually exhausting. Studies on emotional dissonance, that gap between what you feel and what you express, show that this kind of chronic pretending leads directly to emotional exhaustion, to burnout, to what researchers call depersonalization. You begin to feel like a ghost in your own life, watching yourself go through motions that mean nothing. Let me be very clear about what you're actually losing when you try to maintain these incompatible friendships. You're not just losing time or energy, though you're losing those too. What you're losing is something far more precious. You're losing your relationship with your own inner truth. Every time you nod along to conversations that don't resonate, every time you laugh at jokes that no longer feel funny, every time you perform interest in topics that feel increasingly meaningless, you're sending a message to your deepest self. You're saying your truth doesn't matter, your perception isn't valid. What you see, what you feel, what you know must be suppressed in service of social harmony. And your psyche, your soul if you prefer that word, begins to retract. It learns that it's not safe to be honest, to be present, to be real. So it hides. And you end up in this tragic situation where you're surrounded by people, maybe even people who genuinely love the version of you they remember. But you're utterly, devastatingly alone, because the real you, the awakened you, has no witness, has no space to exist, has been exiled in service of maintaining relationships that are, in truth, already over. This is the sunk cost fallacy playing out in its most insidious form. You've invested years, maybe decades, into these friendships, shared memories, inside jokes, a history that feels too valuable to abandon. And so you keep showing up, keep trying, keep hoping that somehow you'll reconnect with what you once had. But here's what psychology teaches us about sunk costs. The investments you've already made, they're gone. They're in the past. The only question that matters is whether continuing to invest serves your present and future well-being. And if you're honest, brutally honest with yourself in those quiet moments, you already know the answer. These friendships have become coexistence, not connection. Mechanical exchanges, not meaningful dialogue. You're staying out of guilt, out of loyalty to who you used to be, out of fear of the emptiness you imagine will follow if you let go. But what you don't yet realize is that you're already empty. The exhaustion you feel after every interaction, that's not just tiredness. That's the hollow ache of self-abandonment. That's your soul grieving its own disappearance. Now, some of you might be thinking, but isn't this just ego? Isn't thinking I've evolved beyond my friends just spiritual arrogance? And I want to address this directly because it's a question that likely torments you. Here's the distinction. If you're looking down on your old friends, if you're feeling superior, if you're judging them as less conscious or less evolved, then yes, that's ego dressed in spiritual clothing. But if what you're feeling is grief, if what you're experiencing is a deep sadness that you can no longer connect in the ways you once did, if you're exhausted not because you think they're beneath you, but because pretending requires a level of self-betrayal you can no longer sustain, that's not ego. That's honesty. That's your system recognizing an incompatibility that has nothing to do with worth and everything to do with resonance. Two people can be equally valuable, equally worthy, equally beautiful, and still operate on frequencies that no longer harmonize. This isn't judgment. This is recognition of reality. The research on spiritual awakening and identity crisis is illuminating here. When the ego begins to dissolve, when the constructed self that society has helped you build starts to crumble, you enter what's called an identity crisis. But this isn't a crisis in the pathological sense. It's a crisis in the same way that a lobster shedding its shell experiences crisis. The old structure no longer fits. It's become constrictive, painful, limiting. And while the new shell is forming, there's this vulnerable period where you don't quite know who you are anymore. You're not who you were, but you're not yet fully who you're becoming. And during this transition, maintaining old relationships based on the old identity becomes almost impossible, because those relationships are constantly calling you back to a self that's in the process of dying. Your friends, without meaning to, keep addressing the old you, keep expecting the old responses, keep pulling you toward patterns that your awakening is trying to move you beyond. And every time you complain, every time you slip back into that old character to make them comfortable, you delay your own transformation. You split yourself. You create what psychologists call emotional dissonance. And over time, that dissonance doesn't just create discomfort. It creates a profound sense of internal fragmentation. Let me share what this looks like in practical terms. You go to that dinner party, and someone complains about a coworker. In the past, you would have joined in, validated their frustration, maybe added your own story. But now, you can see the suffering underneath the complaint. You can see how they're creating their own misery through their interpretation, their resistance, their unconscious patterns. And you have a choice. You can say what you see, risk being labeled as too deep, too intense, too much. Or you can play along, offer the expected sympathy, participate in the unconscious dynamic. Most of the time, you choose the latter. Because you're tired. Because you don't want to be that person who makes everything heavy. Because you're still hoping that if you just try hard enough, you can bridge these two worlds. But here's what happens in your body, in your energy field, when you make that choice. Something contracts. Something dims. You feel a heaviness that stays with you long after the conversation ends. That's not just emotional tiredness. That's spiritual exhaustion. That's the cost of abandoning your truth for the comfort of others. And the truly painful part is that your old friends, they don't understand what's happening. From their perspective, you're the one who's changed, who's become distant, maybe even judgmental. They might think you've gotten weird, too serious, lost your sense of humor, and they're not entirely wrong. You have changed. You can't fully explain it to them because the shift you've undergone isn't something that translates into the language of the old reality. It's like trying to describe color to someone who's only ever seen in black and white. The vocabulary doesn't exist. The frame of reference isn't there, and so you end up in this impossible situation where maintaining the friendship requires you to become smaller, quieter, less authentic, while being yourself means risking the relationship entirely. It's a choice between self-betrayal and loss, and both options hurt. But here's what I want you to understand. What Alan Watts would want you to understand. This isn't a failure. This isn't something you're doing wrong. This is a natural, inevitable part of genuine transformation. Watts spoke about the play of life, about how we're all actors in a cosmic drama. But he also made clear that there comes a point where you must choose between performing a role that no longer fits and stepping into your authentic being, even if that means leaving the familiar stage. He said, waking up to who you are requires letting go of who you imagine yourself to be. And part of that letting go, part of that waking up, involves releasing the relationships that are anchored to the imagined version of you. The friendships that need you to stay small, to stay asleep, to keep performing the character they've grown comfortable with. This doesn't mean they're bad people. It means the contract between you has expired. The shared dream you were both inhabiting, you've woken from it, and they're still there, and there's no way back in without falling asleep again. Now, I know what you're feeling right now. There's probably a part of you that's relieved, grateful that someone is finally naming this experience. And there's probably another part that's terrified. Because if you accept what I'm saying, if you acknowledge that these friendships are no longer serving you, then you're faced with a choice you've been avoiding. The choice to actually let go, to stop forcing, to accept the loss. And that feels impossible. Because who will you be without these connections? Who will you call when you're lonely? Who will remember the person you used to be? These are valid fears, real fears. But what you're not seeing yet, what you can't see from where you're standing, is what becomes possible when you stop pouring your energy into relationships that require you to be less than you are. When you stop betraying yourself in service of maintaining the past. When you create space, empty space that feels terrifying at first, but space that allows for something new to emerge. The universe operates on a principle that might sound mystical, but is actually quite practical. Like attracts like, frequency attracts matching frequency. When you're constantly vibrating at a lower level to match your old friends, constantly dimming your light to make them comfortable, you're literally broadcasting a signal that attracts more of that same energy. But when you stop, when you let yourself be exactly as expanded, as awakened, as authentic as you actually are, even if that means being alone for a while, you begin broadcasting a different signal entirely. And gradually, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, you'll find yourself connecting with people you never would have encountered before. People who don't need you to explain yourself. People who see you not as you were, but as you are. People who challenge you to go deeper, not to stay comfortable. These are soul-level connections, and they're not possible while you're still clinging to relationships based on personality-level compatibility. The old friendships were beautiful. They served their purpose. They were perfect for who you were then. But awakening requires evolution, and evolution requires release. Here's something crucial that often gets overlooked in spiritual circles. This process of losing friendships during awakening, it's not just about other people not understanding you. It's about you no longer being able to tolerate your own inauthenticity. That's the real shift. In the past, you could code switch, play roles, be different versions of yourself in different contexts without much internal conflict. But awakening brings a kind of transparency, a rawness where pretending becomes physically painful. Your nervous system, now more sensitive, more attuned, starts rejecting situations that require you to be false. It's as if your internal lie detector has been turned up to maximum sensitivity, and what you're discovering is that most social interaction, especially within long-established friend groups, is built on layers of unconscious pretense, little white lies, performative interest, suppressed boredom, conflict avoidance, maintaining appearances, none of it malicious, just the standard operating procedure of human socialization. But you can't do it anymore. Not without feeling like you're betraying something sacred within yourself. There's a teaching in Buddhism about right speech, about speaking only what is true, kind, and necessary. But what happens when your old friendships exist in a context where speaking your truth would violate the unspoken rules of the relationship? Where being honest about what you're experiencing, what you're seeing, what you've come to understand, would be received as an attack or a judgment. You end up in silence. Not the rich, comfortable silence of true companionship, but the strained, careful silence of constantly editing yourself. And that silence, that constant self-editing, it accumulates. It builds up in your body as tension, in your mind as fog, in your heart as a heaviness you can't quite name. This is what you're losing when you try to maintain old friendships during awakening. You're losing your voice, your capacity for spontaneous, unfiltered expression, your ability to simply be, without calculation, without strategy, without the exhausting effort of managing other people's comfort. And let's talk about energy, because this is where the loss becomes most tangible. Every interaction with your old friends, you're making an energetic calculation, mostly unconscious. How much of myself do I reveal? How much do I hold back? What topics are safe? What observations should I keep to myself? This isn't connection. This is negotiation. And negotiation requires energy. Constant energy, vigilant energy. You walk away from these interactions feeling drained, not because you've shared yourself, but because you've spent hours managing what parts of yourself are acceptable and what parts must be hidden. Compare that to moments when you've connected with someone, anyone, who operates on your frequency. Maybe it was a stranger at a bookstore, or a new acquaintance who somehow just got it, or even just a conversation with yourself in meditation. You know that feeling of expansion, of ease, of energy actually increasing through the interaction rather than depleting. That's what happens when there's resonance, when there's compatibility, when there's no need to translate yourself into a language the other person can understand. You're not losing energy to the friction of incompatibility. You're simply flowing. Alan Watts had a way of describing this. He talked about life as a dance, and how we get so caught up in trying to get somewhere, to achieve something, to arrive at some future state, that we forget the whole point is the movement itself. And friendships are the same. We think the point is to maintain them, to keep them going, to preserve what we've built. But that's not the point. The point is the connection, the actual felt sense of resonance and recognition that happens between two beings. And when that's gone, when you're just maintaining the structure out of habit or guilt or fear, you're not in a friendship anymore. You're in a memorial to a friendship. You're tending a grave. And every visit costs you not just time but vitality. The life force that could be flowing toward your growth, toward your awakening, toward the new connections that are trying to find you, it's being redirected into this exhausting maintenance of something that's already ended. And your soul knows this. That's why you feel so tired. That's why the thought of another get-together fills you with a dread you can barely admit to yourself. Your soul is trying to protect you from further self-abandonment, and the exhaustion is its way of saying, no more, please, no more. So what do? Because I'm not here to just describe the problem. I'm here to help you understand what's actually happening so you can make conscious choices rather than being torn apart by unconscious conflict. First, you have to grieve. Really grieve. Not just the loss of the friendships themselves, but the loss of who you were when those friendships made sense. That younger, more innocent, less aware version of yourself. The one who could laugh at jokes you now see as unkind. The one who could participate in dramas you now recognize as unconscious patterns. That version of you, it's gone. And you have to let yourself feel the sadness of that, not rush to the spiritual bypass of everything happens for a reason or I'm evolving beyond that. Just simple human grief for what was and will never be again. Let yourself cry. Let yourself feel the loneliness, the fear, the guilt of changing in ways that others can't follow. This isn't weakness. This is honesty. And only through honest grieving can you fully release and move forward. Second, you have to practice what I call compassionate boundaries. This doesn't mean cutting everyone off dramatically or making announcements about your spiritual evolution. It means quietly, gently, pulling back your energy from situations that require self-betrayal. Maybe you stop initiating plans. Maybe you start declining more invitations. Maybe you shorten the time you spend in group settings that leave you depleted. You're not punishing anyone. You're not being superior. You're simply being honest about your capacity and your needs. And yes, some people will be hurt. Some will be confused. Some might get angry. That's not your responsibility to fix. Your responsibility is to honor your own truth, your own awakening, your own path. and to trust that the people who are meant to stay in your life, who can meet you where you are or grow alongside you, they'll reveal themselves through this process. The ones who can't, they'll drift away, and as painful as that is, it's also the most loving thing that can happen for both of you. Because staying in a mismatched frequency helps no one. Third, and this is perhaps the most important, you have to become willing to be alone. Really alone. Not as a punishment or a failure, but as a sacred space. Solitude is where you'll discover who you actually are without the constant pressure to perform various versions of yourself for different audiences. It's where your authentic voice gets strong enough to speak even when it risks disapproval. It's where you learn the difference between loneliness, which is a longing for external validation and connection, and aloneness, which is a deep, rich, full relationship with your own being. Alan Watts spoke often about this. He said that we're terrified of being alone because we're terrified of being with ourselves, of discovering that maybe there's nothing there, or worse, that what's there won't be acceptable to others. But awakening reveals the opposite. What's there, your true nature, is vast, is infinite, is connected to everything. You're not alone in aloneness. You're alone in the sense that you've stopped fragmenting yourself into acceptable pieces. You've become whole, undivided, one. And from that wholeness, that integration, genuine connection becomes possible again. Not based on shared history or habit, but on actual resonance. Let me tell you what happens on the other side of this process, because you need to know there is another side. When you stop forcing incompatible connections, when you stop betraying yourself to maintain the appearance of friendship, something remarkable occurs. The energy that was being drained into that impossible effort, it returns to you, and suddenly you have capacity you forgot existed. Capacity for creativity, for joy, for presence, for depth. You start noticing things you'd been too exhausted to see. The way light moves through leaves. The profound peace of an evening spent alone with a book or music or simply silence. The relief of not having to explain yourself, defend yourself, or diminish yourself. And gradually, as you stabilize in this new frequency, as you become comfortable being exactly who you are, even if that means being misunderstood by people you once considered your closest friends, something magical begins to happen. You start attracting different people, not through effort or searching, but through simple resonance. Someone at a park, a conversation in a coffee shop, an online connection that somehow feels more real than relationships you've had for years. These aren't replacements for what you lost. They're something entirely new. Connections based on who you are now, not who you were then. And here's what you'll discover, what perhaps you're already beginning to sense. These new connections, they don't require the same exhausting maintenance. There's an ease and effortlessness because you're not pretending, you're not performing, you're just being, and they're just being, and somehow that's enough. More than enough. The depth you can reach in a single conversation with someone who truly sees you surpasses years of surface level interaction with people who only knew your persona. This isn't to diminish what you had before. Those old friendships were real. They mattered, they shaped you, but they were meant for a different chapter, a different version of you. And trying to drag them into this new chapter, trying to force them to accommodate a version of you they never met and might not recognize, that's not love. That's attachment. That's fear masquerading as loyalty. What you're losing when you try to maintain old friendships during spiritual awakening is ultimately this: your present moment, your aliveness, your authenticity, your peace. You're losing the opportunity to fully inhabit this new consciousness because you're constantly trying to squeeze back into the old one to make others comfortable. You're losing your voice because you've learned that speaking your truth creates distance. You're losing your energy because you're spending it on translation, on performance, on the exhausting effort of being less than you are. You're losing your joy because you can't be fully present when you're always calculating what's safe to reveal. And perhaps most tragically, you're losing your faith in your own awakening. Because when everyone around you is still operating from the old paradigm, still chasing the same things, still trapped in the same patterns, and you're trying to maintain connection with them, you start doubting your own perception. You start wondering if maybe you're the one who's wrong, if maybe you've just become difficult, if maybe you should try harder to fit back in. And that doubt, that self-gaslighting, it's perhaps the deepest betrayal of all. So let me say this clearly. You're not wrong, you're not broken, you're not being difficult or too sensitive or overly spiritual. You're awake. And awakening comes with a cost that nobody warned you about. The cost is that you can't go back to sleep just to make others comfortable. You can't unknow what you now know. You can't unsee what you now see. And you can't force yourself back into relationships that require your unconsciousness. This is the narrow gate that spiritual teachers have spoken of for millennia. The path gets lonely before it gets spacious. You have to be willing to walk alone, to be misunderstood, to lose connections you thought were permanent, all in service of something that you can barely explain even to yourself. Your awakening, your truth, your alignment with something deeper than social acceptance. And here is where we arrive at acceptance, at peace, at the resolution of this painful transition. You don't have to make dramatic decisions. You don't have to have difficult conversations where you explain how you've changed and they haven't. You don't have to burn bridges or make pronouncements. You simply have to stop forcing, stop performing, stop betraying yourself in service of maintaining what's already gone. You allow the relationships to evolve or dissolve according to their own truth. Some will surprise you, morphing into something different but still meaningful. Others will fade, gently, naturally, like seasons changing. And you'll discover that you're capable of holding the grief of that loss while simultaneously feeling the relief, the rightness, the deep yes of honoring your own path. This is maturity. This is wisdom. This is what it means to become who you are. Trust the process. Trust your awakening. Trust that the friendships that can hold your expanded consciousness will stay, and the ones that can't will fall away, not because anyone is wrong, but because there's a larger intelligence orchestrating the evolution of your life. You didn't choose to wake up. You didn't choose to see beyond the veils that others still find comforting. But you did wake up, and now you have only one real choice: to honor that awakening, even when it costs you everything familiar, or to betray it, and in doing so betray yourself. Choose yourself. Choose truth. Choose the discomfort of authenticity over the exhaustion of pretending. The right people will find you. The real connections will emerge. But first, you have to create the space for them by releasing what's no longer true. And I promise you, on the other side of this difficult passage, there's a life waiting that you can't even imagine from where you're standing now. A life where you're not divided, not performing, not exhausted from managing everyone's comfort. A life where you're simply, powerfully, peacefully you. If this message has resonated with you, if you've felt seen and understood in ways you've desperately needed, please like this video and subscribe to Alan Watts Insights. Share it with someone who's walking this lonely path, because sometimes all we need is to know we're not alone in feeling alone. And remember, what you're losing isn't really loss. It's liberation disguised as grief. Trust that, honor that, and keep walking forward into the truth of who you really are.